And in the meantime, I would like to continue with the presentation of our last but absolutely not least speaker, Jeff Risom. Please, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, so I will share my screen here. Great. So you all see that?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Wonderful. So nice to be the last one here today. Hope you guys are doing okay in this long session. What I want to do is quickly tell you guys about Gale, and I'll do that first and then jump into the meat of the presentation. So I'm actually based here in Copenhagen. We're an urban design practice with offices in Copenhagen, New York, and San Francisco. And we're a multidisciplinary group that tries to always put people first, and I'll talk a lot about that, through design, strategies, and interventions that hopefully solve real challenges for real people in real places. And so we're lucky enough to have worked in many different types of cities. Some of the ones that have been mentioned here in Tel Aviv and Munich are some places that we've been active, in addition to smaller and larger cities in warm and cold climates, and many different types of socioeconomic conditions, really all over the world. And I mention that because we've learned a lot about human behavior by studying the human animal in all of these different contexts. And what we try to do with our work is connect this sort of insight into lived experience with other data and initiatives that are already sort of floating out there. So I think the examples from both Anna and Carlos have been good. I'm impressed by this sort of ability to really get into depth about how people perceive barriers and really following actual behavior. And our work is very much in those lines as well. And it's a mix of observation, of just watching people sort of vote with their feet, and a few other methods that I'll also tell more about. So just the areas that I want to go through is some of these approach to engagement that we use, and tell you a little bit about how it could be applied in the situation of COVID, which we've been studying here since the lockdown of Danish cities in March, and then just a few international examples of how to apply this thinking. So this idea of people first mobility, what it's really about is making it easy for people to do good, right? So if you have a desired behavior, that should be the most convenient, most simple, most comfortable behavior to engage in. You shouldn't have to think in yourself, oh, I'm going to do good today, or be healthy, or be sustainable. Ideally, the city is designed where that healthy, sustainable option for yourself is the one that's also the easiest, so you don't have to think about it. Easier said than done, but that's the ambition. And if I talk a little bit about how do we understand what's easy for people, right? And I mentioned this sort of layer of lived experience, and what we like to do is go out, meet people where they are as part of their everyday routine, meet them in streets and spaces, put ourselves and different stakeholders scattered all over a city with a digital tool in their hand so that they can observe who's walking by, who is cycling, how does that change throughout the course of the day, because they're out there the entire day from like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And indicate things like age and gender, posture, are people standing or sitting, what are they doing? And so in that way, we don't need to ask a person a question, do you like this place? Because if they're there, then they sort of vote with their feet, right? And of course, there's a lot more nuance to that approach as well, but that's the general idea. We do also think it's important to ask people questions. And so we use a variety of different tools. This is from Maptionaire, a Finnish company you guys might know, to also, ask people how they've been using public space during COVID-19, who are you spending time with? So we also add another layer of asking people questions. And then we also look at social media posts and analyze them, and also work together with other partners, JC Metro company in Copenhagen, many other people, along with one-on-one interviews. So I think what's been great that you've seen so far is, you know, Maria, Anna, and Carlos all mentioned various elements of these approaches, and we also try to use them very much towards then making a concrete strategic suggestion, either with design or strategy. And so some examples of how this data really plays out, right? So during the lockdown phase, start of April here in 4 Danish cities, we sent people out using this digital tool and could find, for example, that pedestrian movement in the center of Copenhagen was down, you know, 80 or 65%. We of course measure this periodically so we could compare numbers to last spring. And while movement out in outer neighborhoods of the city had actually gone up, and was able to quantify what a lot of people had a hunch about in a very concrete way, and also make it clear that yes, some streets, some retail environments were suffering, like in the center of town, but others were actually really benefiting, like along high streets and some of the adjacent neighborhoods. Another thing we saw, which was a bit surprising, is we actually saw more kids and elderly using outdoor public space during the lockdown than before. So that also begins to tell us something about, hey, people are using public space as part of their health strategy, almost, to get fresh air and exercise, be with one another, but at a safe distance. Of course, we also measured it again during reopening. Behaviors was changing quite quickly. And this is a composite view of some of our data together with JC Deco. And you can see that general pedestrian numbers, this is along the walking street here in Copenhagen, are back up from their lowest point in April, but it's still not quite as high as what it would be in a typical just winter day. So things aren't quite back to normal. And there's some real challenges that have come out of COVID. So we know from talking to people about their perception of mobility after cities have reopened, this is just from a few months, late August, this survey, people are walking and biking more than ever, but they also are really driving more than they did before. And so this is also a huge challenge and a reality post-COVID that we have to really, you know, we have ambitions about this launching the green transition, but we have a very real challenge with people feeling safer in their car and more justified in using it than maybe they ever have. So what we try to also drill down and understand, you know, very human stories. And so this is, you know, just an observation of a lived experience where during the reopening phase, all kinds of strange things started happening. Here you see a woman out walking her turtle in an area next to one of the main high streets in Copenhagen. And that's an anecdotal just story of, hey, turtle walking, right? That's difficult to quantify, but it does make it real and something that we can remember as a sort of artifact of this strange COVID period. We can combine that with some more hardcore data and say, again, before Corona, during the lockdown and after, in places like this, we actually saw that now, especially for kids in this public space, they've become more popular than before. So it's almost like folks in local neighborhoods have been introduced to parts of their neighborhood they didn't really know existed before during the lockdown, and are now going back again as things are opening up. The same could be said for using local neighborhood spaces for exercise and play, where the percentage has also continued to rise during the reopening period. So we have a bunch of insights. There's a website called covid19.galepeople.com that you can find. But in this context, I think the key is then how do you translate some of these insights, right? I think there's maybe 3 key takeaways for us to think about in the future. One is this issue of car use going up, transit being really challenged, local areas being more popular and important than ever. And I love the Stockholm example of thinking about, you know, those local co-working spaces. That's definitely going to be more important in the future. So how do we begin to locate those in the right place? How do we invite people to them? And then the fact that the social life of the city is changing. You know, there's increased demand for green space, ability to be outdoors, also in the winter. And we think we really need to, you know, channel investments to this in the future. I also just quickly want to go through 3 cases that also give an example of how do you design for behavior change, and again, engage people in a way where they don't necessarily feel like they're being engaged. So the first example here is if you actually totally reframe the conversation about the street, where we're not only talking about mobility and commuting, but we're actually talking about many of the things that bring people together. And so this is a project that we did together with Ford Motor Company, and we created something called the National Street Service. This is predominantly in the US. And some of you might know that in America, there is something called the National Forest Service. And what this is a program to especially help children begin to appreciate and care for the forest. One of, you know, society's most precious natural resources, the forest, and we said, let's apply that to another one of society's most precious natural resources, which is the street, which is typically 30% of all of the space in a city is typically streets. So how do we begin to rethink the purpose of the street, and can we create a whole campaign and program around it? And so this theory of change was about inviting many, many stakeholders to participate, surfacing some shared values. What do we all have in common? Black, white, rich, poor, Muslim, Christian, whatever. And then how do we build empathy between those users, cyclist and motorist, pedestrian, whatever it might be. And so the idea was to try this out in many different types of cities, you know, small little mountain cities like Boise, or large urban centers like San Francisco and Philadelphia. And to do a few very kind of almost silly interventions that citizens themselves brought to the table. You know, can we make signs that encourage you at a stop sign to also wave at someone you know? Or can we put price tags out on things like bike racks and other urban infrastructure so you know how much it really costs? Can we put headphones and tell stories of street corners that might be wonderful and simple, like that's where my grandma used to take me for ice cream, or that's where my husband died from a bike accident where he was hit by a car. So in introducing all sorts of funny things, this driver confessional, where you, after you were a jerk to someone, you could pull in and post your confession. Yes, I cut off that cyclist, or I yelled at that person on the road. Confess your sins. In Philadelphia, we put out 2,000 of these welcome mats, just put them next to parked cars. So the minute you got out or in of your parked car, it said, hey, welcome to walking. So all kinds of seemingly goofy, silly things, but put together in a way where if we truly put our emphasis on these everyday behaviors and everyday interactions with one another and pooled some public and private resources, we could have some real momentum. And again, where the private sector is involved as a partner, but not necessarily the decider. Okay, good. Two more examples quickly. We could also be working with big issues out in cities. So we know that air pollution is a big challenge, even in places like Copenhagen, but many others. And we can actually design to improve it. And so here, working with Google Environmental Insights team, who spent 2 years mapping out the air quality or air pollution of Copenhagen streets, we put that together with this, this Google data is big data. We put that together with this thick data of lived experience, conversations with people, observing their behavior, to basically find out where air quality is really bad and there are a lot of children, but we want to reduce exposure to air pollution there. And that's these light green lines. We can do extra planting, move people away from intersections, whatever it might be. And if we're thinking of this as a network, then we could also invite people to spend more time where air quality is good, the dark green here, but maybe where there's less invitations to actually feel welcome and spend time. So this sort of network effect, again, together with private sector partners, to make very simple strategies that the city can then begin to adopt. Last one is also thinking about, well, what type of, what else should mobility interventions be paired with? I mentioned air quality. We can also think of many, many different issues, whether it be the green transition or supporting car sharing or co-working, whatever it might be. The point is these big systemic challenges that we're talking about cannot be done alone, not any individual organization and not any individual government. There has to be a much more constructive collaboration between citizens, governments, and business. And I know that all of us here sort of want to achieve that. So the question is, what infrastructure, and I mean that social infrastructure, what collaborative infrastructure do we need to really make that partnership much more tangible? And so an example of that is we started working with Lyft, the car ride sharing company, and mostly in North America, to say, well, Lyft, how do you go in and solve the city's challenges through your technologies, rather than Lyft going to the city and saying, hey, will you let us do X, Y, and Z? Can you invert that and say, what goals do you have, city X, and how can we help? And of course, make money, but do so in a way that helps you achieve your goals. And so this was an example where, of course, there's, whether it be bike share or ride share or micro mobility, the issue of docking stations is a big challenge. And so, you know, we started a process where we said, well, how can we incentivize the behavior we want to see, make it easy for people to put micro mobility units back where they belong? How can we very much focus on this idea of individual behavior, but up to this citywide impact? And so this idea of beginning with what the city wants and needs is going to be different in different places. And so with this strategy, you know, in a place like LA, it became very much more about connecting people to transit. In New York, it was about filling the gaps in the existing transit network. In Austin, it might be more about actually community building and building some better connections between especially low-income groups and the government. And again, looking at the private sector to help do that. So this is all fast towards the end of our session, but really what I want to try to summarize is that we can do engagement for engagement's sake, or we can think about the behavior we want and find all the sorts of ways to invite for it. And that's where I think we get a little bit stuck in, well, we need to do engagement, we're finding better ways to engage, and really this is just about, for me, the ideal city would be one where it's more sustainable and healthy, but people don't necessarily believe they're making these sustainable, healthy choices. They're just doing the most comfortable, safe thing, comfortable, safe, and fast way to get around town. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff. A very interesting last comment you make, actually, that it's not so much about engaging citizens, really, but more about just making, not making them aware of the fact that they're actually involved in these processes, right? So I do have a question here to you specifically, because can you help us understand a little bit better the difference between a human-centered approach to technology and a tech-driven, non-human-centered approach, which you actually were mentioning?
Yeah, totally. So I think what we see in a lot of places is the idea of, okay, we can now monitor behavior of citizens through sensors, or it's technologically possible to combine data from all these different providers, or we can provide new digital services or whatever. And there's a tendency to begin with the digital service, technology, innovation, and then sort of push that out to people. And the opposite is to truly begin with human need in its almost pure sense, and then find a variety of solutions. Some of them might be digital or tech related, some might be related to governance, some might be related to something super simple, and then begin with those needs and go from there. And I think, you know, all the examples here on this panel, I think, do that. Start with that human need in different ways. So I think there's lots of good examples of what I think is the best way forward, rather than examples of the sort of technology being forced down people's throats.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just absolutely some elements coming back here with all the 4 speakers. So thank you very much, Jeff. We just have 10 minutes left, so I would like to go over to the panel, but first of all, go to the results of the last poll. Gonna see what the results are. So what is the biggest challenge to implement citizen engagement? What we see, we see behavioral change, trust and fear, trust of people, political fear, the skills of public servants, saying also that the core is equal to freedom, creating awareness. This is interesting to see. So it's really a lot about transparency, the role of the policy makers, actually, of the cities, and trust between citizens and the policy makers. Thank you all for these polls. This is actually also a nice way to continue with some questions.